Hello, my name is Clemens Lode. I'm working as an Agile coach, as a freelancer for various companies for about 5 years now, and I want to share some of my knowledge I gained over the years, especially concerning project management and Agile methods. In this talk today, I want to talk about the idea of having no backlog. An empty backlog, no backlog, just looking at it from that perspective and checking what this would mean for your organization, for your team. First, the question, what is a backlog? What is a product backlog? Backlog is basically like a shopping list. So you have a number of items on the shopping list. You need milk, you need vegetables, you need cheese, you need juice. So you put those items on the shopping list in a certain order. Maybe you sort the items according to the occurrence within the supermarket. So maybe they have in the entrance the vegetables and then followed by milk and cheese and later the juice. So knowing what you will buy and how much it did cost last time, you could really plan for a perfect shopping tour. However, in the real world, you often encounter some obstacles in that regard. You're very lucky if your assumptions like price, like sequence, like location in the supermarket, etc. are all true. Or maybe one item is out of stock and you need to drive to another supermarket or another shop. So there are a lot of issues in the real world that could basically put your plan out of work. Just a real world example. You went through all your items on the shopping list and near the cashier you notice, okay, maybe I should buy some additional chocolate. And you're running out of money. So what do? Which item do you put back? And do you even have time to put it back? Or do you ignore your desire to get some chocolate? So you can easily see how these questions relate to project management of any project. You have a number of items, you have limited time, you have limited resources. How do you sort your basically shopping list or basically backlog? Of course, instead of grocery items in your product backlog, you have something like, set up a website or connect to websites, transfer information between those websites, maybe display data from a database, something like that. But basically, those are all shopping items in this example. Once your project has started, you discover new items. Just like you discover new items in the supermarket, maybe you buy this, maybe you buy that, maybe you put this item, maybe you put that customer wish on your product backlog. So it grows and grows and grows, and you have to manage the product backlog. And here's the question, of course, how do you fill it with backlog items? Who's responsible and what items do you put in? Is it a place for ideas or is it like a roadmap? What is a product backlog in that regard? Or is it just a whiteboard with ideas from various people? What is a product backlog and how it is filled? The most important point to notice here is that product backlog is, obviously about the product. You can't put ideas unrelated to the product into the product backlog. But how do you know which kind of product do you want to build? Of course, you think yourself as all-knowing or very creative, so you think a little bit about it, and then as a, for example, product owner, you go into your room and then step by step fill the backlog with items that you think the customer might need or might wish. The challenge is, of course, you come always with a certain bias into such situations. Usually we think that we know more than we actually do. So do we really know the market? Are we really that all-knowing that we know what the customer wants? Or is it just something that we want? Or who is determining what's going into the backlog? Or maybe you want to feel like you're the boss of the project. So as a product owner, maybe you say, okay, I want this kind of product. So I put these items into the product backlog. But this is actually not what the product backlog is about, and this is not the task of the product owner at all. The product owner is not like the brains of the operation that comes up with ideas and creates the product. So Maybe it is like a misnomer that it shouldn't be called product owner, because in the end, the product backlog is basically a list of notes of conversations you had with the customer. So it's not like ideas you had as a product owner. I have this grand vision about what this all will be, but it is basically a list of notes of conversations with your customer. That is, of course, a different view than it is often practiced in many companies or even taught in, for example, Scrum schooling. So that is a very, very important thing to note, and to really go back to the basics. It is about conversations with the customer. It is not that you come up with ideas somehow and build a product that way. In the previous example about the supermarket, well, who is the customer? It might be yourself. You're buying stuff for yourself. So that's a great part of it. You always are accompanied by, well, yourself, the customer. So at each aisle, you can ask yourself, do I want this? Do I want that? Is the shopping list still valid? Do you want chocolate? Do you want pizza? What do you put into your bin? You can decide in the moment. So basically, if you go to the supermarket and you buy only for yourself, you actually don't need a shopping list. Maybe function of the shopping list in this regard is just to, as a checklist, really to, if you have remembered everything. So you don't go like through the supermarket and go through each item that you meticulously planned beforehand, but simply before the cashier, you look through the items and double check if you have everything. So this is a different view. So actually in this case, you don't really need a backlog. You just go in there and you ask yourself, the customer, all the time, okay, do you want this? Do you want that? Do you want this? Do you want that? And this idea of a constant feedback loop we want to transfer to project management. Or even when shopping for someone else, you could put that person on the phone, ask, for example, if an item is out of stock, you immediately ask the person, hey, what do you want instead? Or you have the person accompany you on the shopping tour. Then, of course, you get immediate feedback. And that is the way we want to go with project management. While this might be costly, it prevents rework later, especially if it's something unknown. I mean, if you buy the same things every week, and you already know that it's available, there are no issues, you just buy the usual items, they're always in stock, then you don't need this agile approach of bringing the customer or member of your family with you to really check, okay, getting feedback again and again. Just like in software, if you build the 50th website that is equal to the other 49 websites you already built, then you don't really need an agile approach in your management. You just move forward with your experience and just build it based on your experience. But applying Agile helps in cases where you want to discover something new, build really new software and not just implement the same thing over and over again. And that is really a key point of new software, of new functionality, that you don't know how it will feel, how it will be in the hand of the users, how the user will interact with it. So you need this feedback from the user, from the customer all the time. And of course, this is the main difference to classical project management. Classical project management, you assume you're in a field of work where you already know the technology, where you know the market, where you can assume that nothing changes. So you can just plan ahead and plan each detail and then deliver the product at the end. But if you're in a more chaotic environment where you don't know the technology, where it's something new, some new functionality, if you don't know the market, if you don't know how the customer will react to your software or to your product in general, then constant feedback loop with the customer is really, really helpful. It prevents very costly rework then and later. Okay, and the next question is, how large should a product backlog be? I mean, I already mentioned, okay, actually you could skip the backlog for shopping lists where you're the customer on site and you get feedback all the time. But still, you could wonder, well, this is with shopping. So please give real advice. How large should the backlog be? So still think again about your shopping list. How much do you put on your shopping list? Do you put next week's grocery shopping list on your current shopping list? No, you just put everything on it that you will be working on, purchasing the next time you visit the supermarkets. You don't put in next week's or months ahead. You don't put that on your current shopping list. So basically your current shopping list is the items you will be working on next. And this analogy can be used also for product backlog. So put only those items in the product backlog that you will actually be working immediately next. So it's not a place for ideas, because even thinking about ideas, you could have spent that time implementing the next immediate steps that the customer needs. So if you do brainstorming sessions with your clients, with your customer, it's great. You can build long backlogs, what you could do or in the future, but maybe invest that hour or day of meetings into finishing what you have already started, finishing the current items, getting feedback from those items. And that is the key, really, to put only that into the backlog. I mean, I've seen very, very, very large backlog. It's sometimes thousands of entries, and no one really had the chance to manage that. And it was always difficult to scroll through and find something, etc. That is not the way to go. It's better to remove all items and really just make your backlog useful, really like a shopping list. Just put in what you will be working next, and everything else. I mean, you can create a document with ideas or something like that. You can put it somewhere else, but really working, really in the working area, just put things into the backlog that you are sure you will be working next. And whenever you find yourself in a meeting where you say, okay, let's put some new features in there. Hey, do we really work on those items next? Or is this just an idea session, brainstorming session that we might be working in a few months or years even? Of course, you could say, well, but if we really plan ahead, maybe we could save some things. For example, the overhead of releasing. Of course, the first argument against this would be, okay, make your release process simpler, that everything is automated, that you just press a button and it is released. I mean, that is one argument. But let's just assume there are some steps to do for release that add, let's say, 10% to your time needed. So you would be more efficient, at least on first glance, if you build really a package. Let's say you work on your product for 10 weeks and then you do a release. Instead of saying, okay, each week you release it and have those 10% each week added for the release. Making 10 releases has a higher overhead than making one release, at least on first glance. If you have your product and can divide it into 10 steps, then each step could already provide value for your customer. You release the first part of your software after 1 week to the customer, and that little function can already provide value to the customer. And in the next 9 weeks, while you're working on the other features, that little feature already produces for 10 weeks or for 9 weeks value for the customer, and that adds up. And the same after 2 weeks, after 3 weeks, after 4 weeks, etc. So you have it all added up. While if you do a big bang release after 10 weeks, you still have produced zero value. You have received no feedback for your work. And the only thing you have saved is a little bit of overhead for releasing, for informing the customer, etc., etc. It's very wasteful to wait with a release. So the basic idea is release often, release early. Coming back to the product backlog, I mean, that means, of course, you don't have a product backlog of 10 weeks. You have a product backlog of 1 week, 2 weeks, or however long your basically shopping list is for a releasable item. And looking at it from the other side, if you already have a backlog and it has a certain length, what does it say about your processes? So I would say basically the length of your current backlog is a measure of time that you have last talked with your customer. So if you have like 3 months of items in your backlog, then you can say, okay, it is more than 3 months since you talked with the customer. Or you will talk in 3 months with the customer. So that is basically a measure. Alternatively, you can also see it as an overhead of discussions you have with your customer. Maybe you have too many brainstorming sessions about what features your customer wants, etc. So maybe invest those brainstorming sessions into testing sessions or into sessions where you invite the customer for feedback. That is much more valuable than having like a large list of items the customer thinks he or she wants. That might not even be true. So after a while, maybe you implement those items and the customer says, now that I've looked at it, I don't want it. And what do you do then? So then it is waste. Sure, maybe the customer pays for it, but it's an unhappy situation for your cooperation with the customer. Similarly, like as a sign, if you catch yourself like, okay, maybe you think about your product and then you start adding items on your own without communicating or without really empirical evidence from your customer, maybe it's time to stop, because why should the customer pay for you at all? I mean, it's just added items. Maybe stop and maybe invest more time into talking with the customer again about feedback. So, but you have learned it maybe a little bit differently. What about Scrum? I mean, in Scrum, you have like sprints, you have a backlog, you have backlog refinements, and you're taught like to use it like a roadmap. You have a whole list of items, and maybe the items at the bottom, they're not yet refined. So that is more the approach of Scrum, at least what I've seen in implementation. But the most important thing is product backlog is not a roadmap. It is not like shouldn't tell you, okay, look at those items at the bottom and we will go there maybe in the future. If you want a roadmap, great. It is like a long-term vision or something like that you keep discussing with your customer in what direction do we want to go, but don't put it into your product backlog. Your product backlog should be items that you will be working on and not like visions or like a pile of ideas. Because every time you look through the backlog, you're thinking again, okay, should we do this? Should we do that? It always takes time. And is it really worth to put it on your basically workplace each day for your developers here that are items we might be implementing in a few years or so? So provide them, sure, with a roadmap, like a philosophical discussion or like a vision that you communicate with them, or talk with the customer and engage with the customer in what direction do we want to go ultimately. That can be helpful to really have a focus. But other than that, don't misuse the product backlog as a roadmap. Yeah, and again, about Scrum, I say can be agile. many companies just take elements from Scrum and lose the focus on what is really important. Because it's not really important to have like sprints or to have backlog refinements. You have to keep in mind what the product backlog is about, items you will be implementing next. That is about, and it doesn't matter that there are backlog refinements or how you improve the backlog or something like that. That adds more confusion than it really needs. So better meet with your team and discuss the next item you will be working on. Discuss it together with the team, not individual tasks that you distribute to individual team members, but really have the whole team focus on it. And then once that is finished, focus on the next, focus on the next, focus on the next. Instead of having like the team refining the entire backlog and having always like a 5-month plan and adapting each month again and again, depending on what you have learned. And again, you invest planning time each week on things you might not even develop. So you really have to wonder, why do I have items like 6 months into the future? Do you want to take a break for 6 months from communicating with the client, or why are there 6 months of items in the backlog? So that is the discussion. From my own perspective, when I wasn't aware much of it in that regard, as a product owner, I really saw it as a like buffer, like, okay, the backlog is filled, okay, I can take 2 weeks off and the team can still work on it. But the real problem is, of course, that is just a symptom of not talking with the customer, not having the customer integrated. Because during those 2 weeks, maybe the customer decides for something else and you lost 2 weeks of work. You don't want that. Another issue is with sprints. Well, not really with sprints, but with the way sprints are integrated into the overall flow of the calendar in companies. So usually it is very easy to convince management to implement something like a sprint, because then you have like 2 weeks and you can have recurring meetings in the calendar, and then every 2 weeks on Wednesday you meet up for a demo, etc. So it's great in those calendars where you have all those recurring meetings that come in between, etc. That shouldn't be the reason why you use sprints, because if you have that structure, what do you do if you want to cancel a sprint? So it seems like with that structure and with calendar and recurring meetings, there's a very high bar of canceling a sprint. So if you're during a sprint, if you discover something, if you change something, what do? Do you wait for the end of the sprint and then do the planning meeting, or do you interrupt and change all the recurring meetings? So usually there is like a drive towards keeping the structure intact and, well, not being agile. That is the problem. Because how is it agile to have a fixed series of meetings? It isn't. If you discover whatever you're currently doing is not helpful, stop that, work on something else. Drop that, meet with the customer, and continue. Another thing is probably why it is accepted is the idea that it prevents interruptions. Like the team can work on an issue for 2 weeks and is not interrupted by like changes or something like that. It is usually an implied argument why sprints are good. But maybe think about that this is a workaround for example, a bad architecture. Maybe the problem really is that it takes a very long time to test something, to implement something, to build something, to deploy something, to get the feedback from the customer. I mean, that is the problem, and that is the reason why people want a sprint. The issue is not to have teams like 2 weeks of work uninterrupted. I mean, that's great, but I mean, if you really want to be agile, you want to be able to interrupt that sprint and change course during the sprint. Otherwise, you lose a week again. For that, you really need to have very good tooling to be able to make changes very quickly. So the idea is, instead of like implementing tasks, and then have like a sprint of simplifying the system, look, whenever you work on something, first change your system, change your existing architecture to make the change easy, and then do the change. So, and in this way you stay, of course, agile, because, for example, okay, you work 2 weeks on a feature and then you get feedback, the customer wants it differently. So how long will it now take to make the change? Another 2 weeks? How can you be sure that whatever you're implementing isn't changed later? So you can't be sure. And an agile architecture expects from you that you have an option to change things very quickly. So basically, you're not just building with an agile architecture, you're not just building a software quickly or something like that. Or you don't just have constant feedback from the customers, you're building the right thing. You're also building a thing that can be changed easily. That is a core idea. And that is something that is really fundamental, to have a system that you can use to make changes quickly. So maybe go back to your architecture, think about what changes are easy to do, what changes are difficult to do. And think about, let's say you want to switch to a different database, you want to switch to a different hosting provider, you want to use a different graphic display, or you want to use a different UI or something like that. How difficult are those changes? Maybe make a list or something like that and see how agile is actually your architecture. And ask yourself if you're misusing the sprints just as a workaround for an architecture that is not agile. So those are my thoughts for the product backlog. On my side, I see the product backlog as not unnecessary, but you really should cut it down to the minimum and really think about what problems will that cause in your organization, in your team. Because that is also a sign what things you can still improve in your organization. You can still improve in your team. Just do an experiment. What would happen if we had only 1 week of items in the backlog? What would you do? Would you invite the customer? Would you have to change the way your architecture works? What would you do? Please leave comments if you like the video, or if you have a different opinion, especially regarding Scrum. You can also visit my blog for a transcript of this video, and subscribe if you like more content about Agile instead of just the old Scrum. In this regard, thank you for listening and see you next time. Bye.